Welcome everyone to this special webinar event in collaboration with Designs for Health and Fullscript. I'm Amy Regan from Fullscript, and I'm so glad that you joined us today. A few housekeeping notes. Please place all questions you have in the Q&A box for a chance for them to be answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be sent via email to all attendees and registrants, and there is a copy of the presentation slides in the handouts section. Today, we have Dr. Oscar Coetzee, who is a dedicated dynamic nutritionist, published author, researcher, educator, ranked professor, and nationally renowned speaker. A pioneer in the field of nutritional science and research, Dr. Coetzee has been a key figure for more than 25 years. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Amy, and welcome everybody. Looking forward to talking to you about this topic. As a little bit of a background, I have dual degrees in psychology and nutrition, and worked as a drug and alcohol suicide intervention counselor at Fair Oaks Hospital in New Jersey for many years. And it's at that point that I realized that psychotherapy and psychology and psychiatry has a place, but it's not the only place. So what I want to talk about today is really some of the baseline stuff. So this is kind of mental health nutrition 101. And I think a lot of you are very familiar with a lot of things that I'll be talking about, but being in this area of specialization, having worked with many anxiety and depressed ridden people, I really always use this as the foundational start of anything that I do. So hopefully you can get something out of this. And at the end, I'll open it up to any kind of questions. All right, so let's see. We know that depression leads to about 15% of suicides of all the people that it affects. It's the leading cause of disability and premature deaths, and it's a second leading cause of disability in people of all ages by the year of 2025. And that is what is predicted. We are truly in a very bad state of almost a pandemic of anxiety and depression, as you see when people come into your office. So I'm not going to go into the depth of all of this, but I kind of highlighted some of the really key ones, right? So when I'm working with patients and I look at, the clinical symptoms of depression, clearly the things like sleep, appetite, energy, digestive dysfunction, concentration, crying spells, being agitated are kind of the commonalities. However, there's many other things that can play a role with that. But the things that really stand out to me with true clinical depression is when people lose interest in things that they used to love and enjoy, especially their hobbies. They start to really neglect their personal appearance. There's a tremendous sense of hopelessness and worthlessness, and then the thoughts of death and suicide. So those four categories to me is really indicative of a very serious state of depression. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm not addressing any of the others, but I also wanted to make sure that we understand that my whole philosophy of psychonutrigenomics, which is, by the way, what I call this area now with psychology, nutrition, and genomics, is kind of a three-legged bar stool. And on the one leg, we have psychiatry. The other one, we have psychology and psychotherapy. And then the third leg is what we're talking about today, which is the nutrients, right? So we know that in anxiety, the DSM diagnosis is for 6 months, you have to have the following indicators, like feeling keyed up, fatigued, your mind's going blank, muscle tension, sleep disturbances, irritability, and then some distress, and some things that could be associated to some physical associations as well when it comes to anxiety, like rapid heartbeat and tachycardia. Now, again, to me, a lot of things that we need to investigate for anxiety and panic attacks is we need to look at the thyroid, we need to look at blood sugar, and we will dig a little bit deeper into this. Now, what's interesting, if you look at ADHD, anxiety, and depression, all the same things keep coming up, like serotonin, dopamine, acetylcholine, norepinephrine, epinephrine. So it's really important to focus on all of that and then kind of tie that back into the individual symptomology. I will talk a little bit later today about some functional tests that we can pick up some specific markers when it relates to where the differentiators are. Now, what's always interesting to me is what the world of psychiatry is always talking about, the experts supposedly in mental health. And what's interesting to me is that we still do not have a specific understanding of where it comes from, right? So here it states major depressive disorder. It's been difficult to elucidate, right? So we are not able in the deep annals of psychiatry as well as psychology to really understand what the causes are of it, because they're multifactorial. And it's not a condition that you can just address with psychotherapy or medication when you're only working specifically on one target. Now, please don't get me wrong. I have nothing against psychiatric medication being used at the right time, right? Because there's definitely a place for this. But most of these issues with these people start with the baseline and the foundation. Now, in the latest publication of the Frontiers in Psychiatry, they came up with this statement: nutrition as a metabolic treatment for anxiety. And what they kind of elucidated here, if you can look at the picture on the right, is they said, why don't we consider omega-3, turmeric, curcumin, vitamin D, maybe a ketogenic diet, avoid sugar, processed vegetable oils, artificial sweeteners, and gluten, and focus on the microbiome. Now, you and I know that we have been saying this for years, right? For years, we've been talking about this. Now, finally, we are moving into the field where even psychiatry is starting to say, okay, listen, there is a very, very strong place for us to investigate this. Now, this is a positive thing, right? Because this has helped me as a practitioner communicate a lot more freely with psychiatrists that I get a lot of referrals from, because we're working synergistically to work people on, helping them with the medication, maybe progressively with a psychiatrist help getting off the medication, and then at the same time kind of compensating with the add-on of these different omega-3s and anti-inflammatories and nutraceuticals. So what is the main rationale that we want to focus on? We all know that the brain has a very specific molecular environment, and several neurotransmitters, amino acids, fatty acids, and carbohydrates play a role there. Why do we have a problem with this? We all know that there's decreased absorption, there's low states of stomach acid, there is dysbiotic issues in the gut that reduce people's ability to absorb nutrients as efficiently. And then we also have herbicides and pesticides that seem to chelate some of these key nutrients that we might need for mental health. So what we want to do is we clearly want to determine what those deficiencies are. And then we want to get some sort of an intervention that, in my opinion, would generally be greater than normal dosing in order to get that person back to a status that they need to be at. So before I go deep into some of these nutraceuticals, I just want to talk about a couple of things. Now, please don't get me wrong. I'm not anti-chocolates. I love chocolate. I just want to elucidate the importance of understanding people with anxiety and depression. They seem to be drawn towards sugar and chocolates, and that is not just because it is a comfort food. Chocolate contains caffeine, which is a stimulant, right? It contains the theobromine, which is a stimulant to humans, but it's fatal to dogs. Phenolphthaleamine, which has an amphetamine-like compound, and then it even works on certain areas in the brain that work with the similar things to pot, right, or THC. So it is kind of a drugstore in its own way. The reason that I bring this up is when I work with anxiety and depressed people, you'll see how much of this they eat, right? It's the same thing when you go to Alcoholics Anonymous and people stop drinking, they start eating a lot of sugar and they start smoking a lot because they're looking for some sort of a replacement to get those dopamine surges. We all know about sugar, right? Sugar is highly addicting. There was a study in 1994 that looked at rats and humans, and what they found is that even cocaine-addicted rats preferred sugar intake as their first source of pleasure rather than the actual cocaine. The other side of that is high glycemic foods light up an area in the brain called the nucleus accumbens, and this has been highly associated with addictive behaviors. So sugar in its own way is definitely something that will drive a tremendous amount of addictive behavior, right? So that doesn't mean that it is a harmless thing to do, because you're really not addressing the addiction. If that person just goes from, let's say, a more serious drug to sugar, it's really important when you're working with anxious and depressed people to really progressively get them on a glycemically controlled diet. Always tell my students at college level, doesn't matter what condition you're working with, the first thing that you always need to do is fix blood sugar, right? Because the blood sugar being fixed, the glycemic control being under control is definitely going to make that person a little bit more able to stick on a protocol. Also want to bring up a couple of major deficiencies in our world today because they all tie into this platform or foundation that we're talking about today, and they are fiber, B vitamins, even glutathione. Okay, so if we look at the status of fiber intake in the world, but let's focus specifically on America. Down at the bottom, you can see that the USA, the average person is taking in approximately 16 grams of fiber. Now think of that for 1 second, right? Ancestrally, it's believed that people took between 50 to 120 grams per fiber. So what does that affect? That clearly affects our microbiome, right? The microbiome have bacteria like lactobacillus and acidophilus. Those things help us produce aromatic amino acids, tryptophan, tyrosine, and phenylalanine. Those things convert to serotonin and dopamine. So one of the biggest areas that people need to start addressing is fiber intake. Not a lot of people are paying attention to that, but fiber needs to be addressed. And I'll show you some studies later on that actually talk about fiber and anxiety and depression. Second category that I brought out here is this astronomical state of diabetes, prediabetes, and type 2 diabetes in the United States of America. If you look at clinical studies, it is completely connected to higher levels of anxiety and depression as well. So blood sugar regulation plays a massive role. Number 3, B vitamin deficiencies. So if you look at the prevalence of binge drinking and alcohol intake in the US, please understand that that's one of the main reasons that we have such a B vitamin shortage in most people's diet. Apart from the fact that we have glyphosate and, not great stomachs to absorb and chelate those things, we have a huge amount of alcohol abuse. And when we do that, we are especially depleting the B vitamins, which are vital for mental health. And I'll show you some of those associations. Some of the other key nutrients that we will talk at our baseline would be zinc, omega-3s, and magnesium. Now, if we look at the zinc deficiency all over the world, we can see that the US is not the worst, but it's certainly not the best. If we look at omega-3 deficiency, we are not exactly the pride and joy of omega-3 status when it comes to the world population. And then we're looking at magnesium. If you are looking at the data from the RDA, that 25% people are at the RDA for magnesium intake, 55% people are below the RDA, and 20% people are well below the RDA. And when we all look at the RDA, some of us might agree or disagree that it is probably not the best standard for optimization, right? So if you look at those numbers, it's almost 90% people are deficient in magnesium. So if you take the zinc, the omega-3, the magnesium, the B vitamins, and the fiber, and the fact that most people are slightly hypoglycemic or potentially dysglycemic, now it's starting to paint a picture of very, very strong underlying components that are missing to make a person happy and to have certain pathways function properly. The other one is vitamin D. Not going to spend a lot of time on this one, but we know the connection between vitamin D and the immune system. But it also has a very, very strong correlation to neuropsychiatric disorders. And what the big thing is that people are always saying, well, you know what, vitamin D, just get it in the sun. Well, if you look at this little picture on the right side here, you can see that in North America, 60% of people are vitamin D deficient. And I come from Africa. I'm sorry, North Africa. I come from Africa, and I'll tell you, it's a pretty sun-ridden world. So that is not the reason. One of the reasons that we are so vitamin D deficient is because we use so much of it, because our immune systems are consistently under attack. Let's talk a little bit about the depression and omega-3 fatty acid association. What we do know about omega-3s is that they support the nerve membrane cell functioning. They are involved in the roles of neurotransmitter binding and signaling. They make second chemical messengers that help us with several chemical reactions to the nerve cells. And one of the major things that they do is they suppress inflammatory cytokines, which is also known as cerebral allergy. Then also brain-derived neurotropic factor, right? We know that brain-derived neurotropic factor requires omega-3, and it actually also requires zinc, by the way. Brain-derived neurotropic factor, when it's low, people are depressed. That is a fact. So it is not uncommon for us to see that, because the average person in the US today is either 1 to 10 to 1 to 20 in omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acids. Folate. What do we know about folate? Folate is a methyl donor. It increases central nervous system serotonin levels. It increases the number and the manufacturing of monoamines like epinephrine and norepinephrine, dopamine and serotonin. Also take in consideration that a third of people that are depressed are also low in folate. And there's connections between elevated homocysteine levels in depression because it correlates again with the need for more folate, B12 and B6. And that's what I mentioned to you earlier. One of the biggest depleters of B vitamins in our body is the intake of alcohol. Now let's just look at this. This is also always a very, very interesting slide for me to talk about. If we look at the symptoms of B vitamin deficiency, right, you can see that they include fears, fatigue, depression, paranoia, confusion, hostility, rage, and anxiety. Now let's look at the generalized symptoms of neuropsychiatric disorders: morbid fears, severe fatigue, depression, paranoia, confusion, anger, suicidal tendencies, and anxiety. And there's no doubt that there is a correlation. Now, correlation isn't causation. We all know that. But maybe we need to start focusing on the B vitamin status of everybody that comes into our offices, because many times that is an underliner. What else happens? A lot of medications that people are on have certain nutrient depletions, right? And some of those are B vitamins. So sometimes the medication that's showing an improvement on one side is potentially driving maybe issues on the other side. So that's why it's so important to look at proper drug-nutrient interaction when people are on a medication, and they have to be on a medication. It's certainly important to look at those nutrient deficiencies. Niacin, I always find it very interesting that niacin actually works a little bit like a benzodiazepine. So it really, really has a very strong connection to a natural antidepressant and anti-anxiety. And it's also involved with glucose intolerance regulation, right? So it's really important when we are talking about the blood sugar dysregulation and that association to anxiety and depression, that we do not forget that B3 plays a major role with that. Again, here, this is a study that looked at vitamin D and depression, but the vitamin D was not just directly associated with the brain. It's because we have immunomodulation, inflammatory regulation, HPA axis control, intracellular calcium homeostasis, monoamine neurotransmission. All of these steps require vitamin D. And if people are low in vitamin D, they can just not control the amount that is required to have function in all those areas. And with a population and a world that is so down on immunity, so overdriven in pesticides and herbicides and stress, and the amount of pressure that we put on our bodies from all sorts of angles, it is not surprising that we have vitamin D deficiency. Let's look at a couple of key components when it comes to copper, zinc, and manganese intake. So if you just look at these quickly, zinc, magnesium, iron, and copper are involved with glutaminergic systems. Zinc, magnesium, calcium, chromium, and lithium are involved with monoaminergic systems. Zinc, magnesium, and copper with GABAergic systems. Zinc and magnesium with the limbic, hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal cortical axis. So this is not often talked about, but it's really important to look at the baseline of that. And what is one of the biggest extractors of this in our world today is some of the herbicides as chelators, right? So we're pulling a tremendous amount of minerals out of our bodies by a lot of herbicides and pesticides. And that's why people on a modern standard diet are lacking these things and indirectly could play a role with anxiety and depression. I'm going to show you a couple of studies. In this particular double-blind placebo-controlled study, they physically looked at magnesium 3 and 8 only as it relates to people with severe anxiety and stress. And this was done on 109 Chinese factory workers. And what they found is that just the use of standard magnesium 3 and 8, there was an improvement. And they looked at a really, really specific clinical memory test as well as stress tests when they reviewed this. So it was a very powerful study indicating the use of magnesium. And I showed you earlier the level of magnesium deficiency, right? Fiber, here's the study that I wanted to mention to you, and there's several of them that looked at fiber intake and psychological disorders in adults. And they found that there was a statistical significant change with people that didn't take enough fiber in. Interesting one. been working with artificial sweeteners for a very, very long time. And this study looked at aspartame intake with anxiety and depression. And they found a very, very strong correlation between depression and aspartame intake. And this study was interesting because they looked at different levels of intake of aspartame, right? So a higher level and a lower level, and the higher level showed significantly more anxiety and depression indicators than the lower level. In my opinion, is probably something that you want to exclude completely. And the amount of people that come into our office on artificial sweeteners is also astounding. So this is also part of the baseline that needs to be addressed. Glyphosate, all familiar with it. What does glyphosate do? It's a chelator, it's a desiccant, it pulls metals out of everything. And this is why I believe that we have such a shortage of the zinc, the manganese, the copper, the iron, and all the things that play a role when it comes to anxiety and depression, when we looked at that little study that I showed you a little earlier. What about GABA? We do know that when people have low levels of GABA, they do not have the ability to reduce beta waves, and those are associated with scattered thoughts and hyperactivity. In a couple of minutes, I'll show you the pathway of how GABA is formulated and what nutrients are involved with that. And here it is. If you look at the formation of GABA, you can see that we go from the Krebs cycle to glutamate, and glutamate to GABA. High requirement, vitamin B6. That is something that is showing up consistently low or compromised when I look at metabolomics or organic acid testing. When we look at tryptophan, tryptophan converts to 5-HTP, and then that goes to serotonin and then to melatonin. Now, that's not the point I'm trying to make. The point that I'm trying to make is look at the intermediate steps. You require iron for step 1, vitamin B6, B12, folate, and then for serotonin to convert to melatonin, zinc and magnesium play a role. So this is kind of why magnesium helps us sleep, right? But also the zinc deficiency. And people that don't sleep well, or people with circadian disruption, are normally the people that are going to be more anxious and depressed. The other thing that we need to look at is the tryptophan requires insulin as a transport mechanism to get into the blood-brain barrier. So people with dysglycemia, blood sugar dysregulation, are generally going to have a problem with that conversion. This is why I say that unless you have proper insulin response, you're insulin sensitive, it's very difficult for these conversions to happen. Same thing for tyrosine, converts to dopamine. You require vitamin B6 as well as vitamin C and copper in order to get to norepinephrine and epinephrine. Anemia. It's very, very strong correlation when you look at the literature in anemia, and I'll show you a study right at the end of this presentation. It is a ubiquitous mineral. It goes everywhere, and it is extremely important that at the same time that you're looking at blood sugar dysregulation in individuals, you also need to look at their status of anemia of several kinds, right? Iron anemia, B6 anemia, any of the anemias is a really important marker to look at, but specifically iron anemia. Also remember that iron plays a role in thyroid hormone formation. So if a person is anemic, they're also generally going to have issues with their thyroid. Let's talk about hypothyroid, and I'm not going to go into this. All of you have access to this presentation. I just pulled out a couple of studies here that tied in major depressive disorder by investigating thyroid and hypothyroid, and it's very strongly correlated. I don't think there's anybody on this call that doesn't know that, but sometimes we don't address the hypothyroid, but a person gets put on a psychotropic. You know, it's really important to deal with the blood sugar, the hypothyroid, and then the medication discussion. Hypoglycemia, really an important one to look at, right? A lot of people confuse panic attacks with hypoglycemic attacks, right? Because they're very similar. I'm not saying they're exactly the same thing, but look at the symptoms of hypoglycemia versus panic attacks. You are going to have sweating, dizziness, anxiousness, headaches, irritability when you are dealing with either of this. So it's really important to focus on balancing the blood sugar again and getting that person from a hypoglycemic state to a more regulatory state from their blood sugars. This is no surprise again, folks. Circadian rhythms, how much they play a role with depressive disorders. Please make sure that you are investigating several things, but specifically, when you're talking about the brain waves, when people are supposed to be at status of regulatory alpha, beta, delta, gamma, and theta waves, we do know that decreased alpha waves and increased beta waves can affect low delta and theta waves, and that's how anxiousness and nervousness is driven. So there are several nutrients, several ways to improve it, but please understand that there is a huge connection between the circadian rhythms and anxiety and depression. This was an interesting study that looked at neuroinflammation, specifically looking at fried foods with depressed individuals. So this was a population-based study that looked at about 140,000 people, and they found that the acrylamide found in potato fried products had a strong association with the drive of anxiety and depression through neuroinflammation. So that's another thing that we need to address. So we already have artificial sweeteners, right? We have herbicides and pesticides, and now we have fried foods. And these are all things that people just think are innocuous, right? They do not necessarily always want to address these. These are really foundational things that need to be addressed when you really want to work with anxiety and depression in the long term. And this is not a short-term fix, right? To fix the foundation. Most of the patients that come into my office to work on this understand that this is a 3 to 6 month ordeal, but they want to do it the right way. Most of us are familiar with LPS, right? Lipopolysaccharides, the breakdown product or the endotoxin produced by gram-negative bacteria. It's a major driver of neuroinflammation. If you put LPS into the research engine, you will, of PubMed, you will find a huge amount of articles. So we can pick up gram-negative overgrowth in stool testing, and I suggest that we start focusing more on that if you want to deal with anxiety and depression. And there are several really good protocols that can help reduce the allostatic load of LPS in the gut. Talking about lipopolysaccharides, what a lot of people don't understand, it is only when the gram-negative bacteria has died off that this becomes a problem. So high load, high die-off is a major player there. And only one part of LPS is actually toxic, and that's called the lipid A part of the LPS. Now, there are several things that LPS affects, and we're just going to go through a couple here. It affects the microglia. It makes your body insensitive to the natural processes of what microglia is supposed to do, which is the immune cells in the brain. It increases the permeability of the blood-brain barrier. It drives amyloid plaques, especially in people with multiple sclerosis. And it's funny because LPS seems to attack the weakest part of our bodies. What are the ways to lower LPS? Limit trans fats, the study that we just looked at. Avoid alcohol, B vitamin association. Limit NSAIDs, optimize liver function, utilize maybe some serum immunoglobulins because they are helpful in binding the LPS. Use anti-inflammatories, and then modulate the microbiome. Here's a study that looked at basal and LPS-stimulated inflammatory markers in the course of anxiety symptoms. And if you read through the study, you can see that they found high levels of inflammatory markers that have high levels of anxiety consisting of physical arousal. Tons and tons of studies that support that. Let's just talk a little bit about the probiotic and the prebiotic discussion. Without a doubt, there's a huge amount of data in support of that. I think the psychobiotics are becoming very prevalent now, and they certainly play a role. I might mention one in a couple of minutes here that I've used clinically with great efficacy. But we certainly need to go to the gut to address this, because in the gut is where we're going to address some of that LPS. Low commensals would be a real connection to anxiety and depression because of lack of lactobacillus and acidophilus that'll help us with those aromatic amino acids. A couple of my doctoral students actually went into a lot of studies, and they posted this review article. They looked at several strains of various kinds of what people would perceive as good bacteria and found all sorts of studies backing it up. So there is no question that the bacteria in our guts play a huge role when it comes to mental health. Now, is it maybe an isolated form that does a better job than another one? I think it's early stage today to really quantify that. But I will tell you that when I've seen healthy GI tracts in functional stool testing, I've certainly seen less issues with anxiety and depression. So I think, is there a specific group of probiotics that would be the answer to it? If you go according to these studies, you can see longum, fragilis, plantarum, rhamnosus, bifidum, infatis. I mean, all these bifidobacteriums play a role. Bifidobacterium seems to have a real strong effect on this, especially the bifidobacterium longum strains. And then you get into a very specific strain called bifidobacterium longum 1714, which we'll touch on briefly. And just more studies, folks, for you to go through and just kind of investigate. But I just found it so interesting that it's stress and anxiety is reduced by using a dose of Lactobacillus plantarum. GI symptoms and anxiety and stress reduced with Lactobacillus acidophilus. And it just goes on and on and on. So is a good probiotic a bad idea when it comes to anxiety and depression? Absolutely not. But I still think digestion, LPS, the basic micronutrients need to be addressed before we go down this road. Quickly want to touch one more section here. When we're looking at these specific probiotics, they're very unique. And what science is starting to pick up is we're starting to see the connection between the immune system and our gut and mental health. So it's very interesting, right? So you have these bacteria in your gut that the immune system would then kind of attack, so to speak, break apart, and then the body will take those particles and translocate them to the brain. So specific things would be these peptidoglycans that is mentioned in this picture. And what's interesting, if you look at infants, they actually have peptidoglycan receptors. So what we try to say is that the bacteria in our gut has communication with the bacteria in an infant's brain and our brain because there's certain receptors for it. And yet we've never really paid attention to that to the level that we should, even though we've known that it's been involved with neurodevelopmental processes forever, right? So the status of the mom during pregnancy, her gut health is extremely important when it comes to the neurodevelopment. And maybe we will discover that in the future, that there is a very, very strong connection between the microbiome health and maybe the prevention of some of these neurodegenerative disorders that we're seeing today. Also like to mention that you might want to look at something called the tryptophan kynurenine pathway. That's basically where tryptophan gets broken down to kynurenine and then quinolinic acid. That is the wrong pathway that tryptophan can go down. The best way to look at that is a organic acid or a metabolomics test to make sure that people are not having a negative effect from tryptophan. A couple of tests I just want to go over with you. I like to look at these tests when I'm working with people with anxiety and depression symptomology. For instance, I want to look at 5-hydroxyindolacetic acid because when it's extremely low, it can tell us a little bit about, have you been diagnosed with depression? Do you have any insomnia? Maybe there are issues with chronic pain. When we see this marker elevated, then we can look at, is that person taking tryptophan? Are they on an SSRI? And kind of work from there. Or have they had a diagnosis of hypervigilance? If I look at the dopamine conversion, right? So if we look at this little picture right at the bottom, we can see that tyrosine converts to dopamine and then epinephrine, norepinephrine, then manolate and homovenolate or VMA and HVA. These are really important markers to look at if you're trying to pick up if a person is stressed and wired or stressed and tired, because it's really important to pick the right one because both of these will drive anxiety and mental health disruption, right? So when we have HVA and VMA very elevated, it might be a heightened sympathetic reaction to response, might indicate the need for adrenal support. And also cortisol, when cortisol, HVA, and VMA ratios are quite high, that's more of a stressed and wired individual. And then in the next one, I'll show you more of a stressed and tired individual, right? So this person has kind of burnt out the substrate. Eventually, the cortisol will start to drop as well. And this person would go into a real adrenal suppressed state. So I love these tests because I can look at stressed and wired and stressed and wired to tired to determine exactly where I want to go with that patient. Here's another indication of GABA. GABA is extremely low. Even though in these tests it's not indicated, we found clinically that if it's extremely low, anxiety and panic attacks and some sleep disturbances might be associated, and you might want to investigate IBS or maybe even fibromyalgia symptomology. So here's a perfect picture of what a stressed and tired person would look like. The HVA, VMA ratios are low, the cortisol is low. So this is really a burnt out individual. Methylmalonic acid, we know the central nervous system association with that. A tremendous amount of medications deplete B12, including metformin. So please make sure that you pay attention to that, because that whole methionine folate cycle where you have folate and B12, the whole MTFHR thing plays a significant role with that. I'm always intrigued with organic acid testing because when you're looking at methylmalonic aciduria, that shows up 10 days after deficiency in urine, whereas it takes 137 days to show the entire anemia or deficiency. So I really feel that when we're looking at preventative and when you're helping a person go out of anxiety and depression status, make sure that you retest to see the progression. And here's the other point that I always try and make to people is please take in consideration that most of the time when people come to us, they're very sick, they're depressed, they're anxious. Our profession really needs to start looking at, okay, so we've helped this person and we tested them at the point of when they didn't feel well. We really need to get functional testing done when people feel better so we can start seeing what it looks like, right? So what I started to do is once my patient really improves in their health, I run another organic acid test, another GI test, so that I can look at what their feeling good looks like. So we have a baseline, and then you use that baseline on a yearly basis for, further investigation. Okay, again, I'm just going to quickly go over the gram negatives here, the LPS. I love looking at all the gram negative bacteria, so I've grouped them all together here for you. So I like to look at them on any kind of stool test, regardless of what company you use. These markers are going to be on them. I just group them into one category, right? So you can see I like to look at them all together because this is going to give me a good indicator of where this person lies. Now, in this particular person's case, they have one elevation, and one is almost too many, right, when it comes to LPS. So if this person has permeability, elevated zonulin, leaky gut, with a high level of gram negative, it's going to drive LPS. Barrier integrity, I always like to make mention of this one. If you are looking at a lot of blood work, just standard blood work, and you can look at ALK phos. Now, I know that a lot of us look at ALK phos when it's low, maybe can indicate the zinc or magnesium indicators. That's also relevant to what we spoke about today. But a very elevated ALK phos is actually a high indicator of LPS. So keep your eye on that. Because alkaline phosphatase actually binds to the lipid A. You remember that toxic part of LPS, and 100-fold decrease of pro-inflammatory cytokines, because that's what alkaline phosphatase job is. The second category that we want to always focus on from a gut barrier integrity standpoint are the species of Akkermansia, Faecalibacteria prausnitzii, and Roseberia. And you know that we are consistently looking at that. And if you look at the literature, especially Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, it's coming up tremendously in scientific literature as one of the issues with anxiety and depression. We all know about zonulin and secretory IgA, immunological indicators. But look at the ALK phos and go look at some of these species of anaerobes. Gut barrier integrity, keep your eye on zonulin, keep your eye on the gliadin markers, but keep your eye on the overall awareness of all these bacteria, because they do play a role with, do you have enough to keep that gut barrier, in a protective, in a very strong state from permeability. Also like to look at some of the histamine and immune indicators, because that is generally where we're sucking a lot of the vitamin D out. But if I had to pick an area in a stool test that is going to be helpful for me with anxiety and depression, I'm going to look at the permeability, and I'm going to look at the LPS markers. Microbiome diversity, we always want to look at our commensals, right? Bifidobacterium, lactobacillus, all those species that my doctoral students looked at in research, they found such a strong connection between all these good commensals and our health. And this is where the fiber comes in again, right? And that's probably what that study indicated. The higher intake of fiber drove higher substrate of food for the good bacteria, and that way, there was better production of aromatic amino acids. A couple of studies here to finish off with. Altered gut bacterial fungal interkingdom networks in patients with current depressive episodes. So yes, we want to keep an eye on Candida. Great place to look at that is in stool testing. The other area that you might want to investigate here would be arabinitol in a organic acid test. Here's the study that I was talking to you about. Fantastic article, folks. If you ever want to read something that'll kind of blow your mind a little bit, it's this review article called Gut It, Unraveling the Role of the Microbiome in Major Depressive Disorder. And you can see that Faecalibacterium prausnitzii here was one of the major indicators. On the next one, it talks a little bit about the Bacteroides firmicutes ratio, also in major depressive disorder patients. Well worth investigating that and keeping your eye on that. And then also the long-term use of psychotropic drugs actually has been indicated to influence the microbiome initially positively, but in the long term maybe negatively. So it might be important to kind of, on these psychotropic medications, to give support, because again, there are very often cases that these people need to be on those medications. This article looked at spore biotics. If all of you are familiar with spore biotics, it looked at spore biotics and anxiety and depression in a young population. So what they did is they provided a bunch of students with a high processed diet. All of them had permeability and anxiety. They gave them the spore-based probiotic, and that improved all of those indicators. And probably the main reason for that is the spore-based probiotics actually helps to reduce the LPS, and it helps to reduce the permeability. So elevated LPS and gut permeability or leaky gut is going to drive anxiety and depression. Fatty acids and brain-derived neurotropic factor. Here's a study that looked at that. Really interesting read, because as I said to you, that there's a very strong connection between low brain-derived neurotropic factor and anxiety and depression. Anemia and healthy adults. Remember, initially I told you about anemia and the importance of it. And we can just see here, in healthy adults from the general population, we found a significant and robust association between depression and anemia. So please address anemia. A meta-analysis of inositol for depression and anxiety disorders. Our results suggest that inositol may be beneficial for depressed patients, especially with major depressive disorder. So many little nuances to take in consideration, but most people with PCOS, inositol is very helpful, but there's also insulin issues. So again, it ties back into that whole insulin blood sugar regulation. I'm always amazed at curcumin, right? Just look at this study, again, in the frontiers of psychiatry. Modulation of neurotransmitter concentrations, inflammatory pathways, excitotoxicity, neuroplasticity, HPA adrenal disturbances, insulin resistance, oxidative stress, and the endocannabinoid system. There's almost nothing that curcumin doesn't do, right? So it might be worthwhile to make that a recommendation to people as well. This study looked at a population of people in prison, and one of the standout things with them was vitamin C. And if you can remember, in the dopamine pathway, we require vitamin C to convert norepinephrine and epinephrine. So there was a lot of improvement in behaviors by just increasing something as simple as vitamin C. Here's the zinc and Neuropeptide and Depression Association. And this really looked also at zinc and how it drives brain-derived neurotropic factor. So again, the zinc is extremely important. Now, all of this is, I'm going to summarize this into this chart for you. I know I went over this rather quickly. I only had 45 minutes, which I completely stuck on. But here's the summary. If you want to, at baseline, completely eliminate an underlying issue before you go into further investigation, these are the things that you need to cover. Exclude and figure out and treat anemia, hypothyroid, hypoglycemia, LPS, intestinal permeability, insomnia, and candida. Tremendous amount of studies support each one of those categories when it comes to anxiety and depression. Is it possible for a person to be regulated in all those areas? Absolutely. That's what we do on a daily basis, right? That's before you do any kind of supplementation or anything else, if you can focus your attention there. Then remove gaming. I didn't mention that in one of the slides, but gaming is becoming a major issue of addiction, right? Glyphosate, aspartame, fried foods, alcohol, and then lower those comfort foods that drive those behaviors of self-medication, more like sugar and chocolate. At birth, encourage breastfeeding, vaginal birth, try and eat seasonally, local, organic, and really focus on the glycemic index of what people are eating so that we don't overstimulate that nucleus accumbens. Work on sleep hygiene, relaxation, and hobbies. Really use functional tests, standard blood work like ALK-Phos, right? Blood sugar, hemoglobin A1C, organic acids, genomics, and GI testing. And then fix the gut dysbiosis, right? And then finally, the key nutrients, Bifidobacterium longum 1714, a very specific strain of Bifidobacterium. Great results. Personally, clinically, I've seen, as well as pretty well supported in the literature. Really focus on prebiotics, probiotics, postbiotics, and sporebiotics. They're all relevant. Vitamin D, C, omega-3, Bs, folate, B12, B6, chromium, threonate, theanine, fiber, glycine, inositol, curcumin, iron, zinc. Now, you might say, well, that's crazy. That's just about everything. Well, that's my point. My point is I've spent my entire life working with anxiety and depression. Where I have seen the most success in my life as a practitioner is when I've covered these bases. The amount of improvement that I've seen at baseline is dramatic. It's much better than I've ever seen with a short-term use of something more powerful. Once you've done this, and maybe there's still indicators, then deeper psychotherapy, psychiatry, and those things might play a role. So that's it from my side. I'm going to open up to any kind of questions at this point. Amy, thank you.
Wow. Oh my goodness. I feel like I want to print out the second to last slide there and just keep it up to remind myself. Oh my goodness. Everyone, the slides are available in the handout section for download. I got a couple questions about that. And then the recording will also be sent via email a couple of days after we've had some time to put some nice music to it and a nice title slide. So we've got like a ton of questions here. Thank you so much, Oscar. This has been really wonderful. I'm going to dive right in here. So we just had a question about your brief mention of video games. Are you recommending, to just keep an eye on those? And like, what are your thoughts on cutting out video games in patients?
Yeah, so, I started to look at that because the gaming thing, for me, from a neurological standpoint, is where I've really had an interest in and what the effects that it has on dopamine. In some of the literature that I've looked at and some of my research students that really investigated this for me, it's shocking. It's almost as strong as cocaine. Like if they looked at the studies, from gaming versus, so yes, regulate it as much as you want to. I spoke in China on this topic, and it's interesting because they regulate gaming for no more than an hour and a half a day on any kids, right? So they're not allowed to do more than that. But the sad part of that is not just kids, it's adults. Some of these studies are looking at adults that are so addicted to gaming that they can't let it go. So it's a dopamine thing, right? It's giving you that excitatory thing. It's almost like, the the risky behavior that drives that excitement, and then the overstimulation. But yeah, I mean, it actually has the same neurocognitive reaction that most medications have. So it's or illicit wrong drugs, right?
For sure.
Yeah, regular.
Let's see. Jessica asks, what time of day would you recommend taking GABA, and are there any contraindications?
Yeah, I mean, you certainly want to be careful with GABA, especially if people are on certain neurotropic medications. Personally, I've never really found any specific time of day that really makes a difference for me. What I have found is that I personally like to take it away from anything. So I take it in isolation. I don't take it with food, but that is the way I look at it. I can't tell you that I found any kind of studies that really supports that for me. It's just kind of trial and error, from a clinical perspective.
Excellent. Debbie asks, what are optimal doses of zinc and chromium, and which form of chromium would you recommend?
Yeah, that's a good question, because we have so many different, dosing requirements from age. So, that's something that I probably won't want to just throw a number out, because there's weight and age and requirements involved. What's the second part of that? What kind of chromium?
Yeah.
That is also a debate. Many people think what's the it's not picolinate, it's the other one. I can't think of it right now. That's the one that's mostly in the studies, is chromium picolinate. I do not know the other one off the top of my head right now. I don't know why it's escaping me, but that's not been that profound in the studies. So they're not very definitive on the specific kind of chromium.
Okay, perfect. Let's see. Another question we have is, what are your favorite sources of dietary fibers?
Whole food. Yeah, fruits and vegetables that are seasonal. For me, though, if I have to do supplemental fibers, I probably would say inulin. One of the major players for me. But I like to keep people very diversified there. And by the way, I just want to retract a little bit on that GABA thing. Make sure that people understand that if they want to use GABA, it's going to be a pharma GABA, right? Not just standard GABA, because pharma GABA can cross the blood. It's a little bit more selective when it comes to the blood-brain barrier crossing. When you have standard GABA and it gets through the blood-brain barrier, it's actually normally an indication of permeability, right? So if GABA works for you, it's sometimes not an indication that it's a good thing. So it's a little bit of a complex thing. I don't know how much you guys have gone into that on any kind of discussions, but you need to make sure that you use the right kind of GABA at the right time.
Thank you. Eugene asks, what are your thoughts on nutritional lithium orate?
I don't have much experience with that, but I've had several colleagues that have had great success with lithium integration.
Excellent. And what about copper supplementation? Do you have any thoughts on copper?
As far as whether it plays a role
Yes.
in what we talked about today? Absolutely. I mean, one of the conversions of, I think it is dopamine to norepinephrine, is a copper requirement, right? So for that section of conversion to get to optimized control of anxiety through epinephrine and norepinephrine, copper is extremely important. Again, I'm very leery at throwing dosing out because I've used such a wide variety of dosing. I don't want to sculpt it into one. Generally speaking, if you're working with a lot of these companies that these practitioners are working with, whether it's Design for Health or any other company, the formulations that are in those ingredients are a pretty good base because they're already at a functional level. So depending on age and size, I normally would just go down with the children a little bit, maybe cut by half or by a quarter, and then go up in adults. I am not scared to sometimes updose a little bit until I get results. Because most of this is reasonably innocuous, right? There are certain areas that you want to be aware of, but just whatever company you use, start at whatever their baseline is, because most of those are based on functional criteria of dosing, right? Not RDA based.
Makes sense, definitely. Lauren just asked if you could please review what you said about niacin and glucose intolerance. Just kind of go over that again.
Yeah, so niacin plays a really important role in the regulation of blood glucose. So it's actually one of the nutrients that is picked up mostly in individuals with early stage dysglycemia or blood sugar dysregulation, and that goes with chromium as well, right? So a combination of the niacin and the chromium is really important when it comes to blood sugar regulation. There's a reasonable amount of literature on that. If you go throw that into a PubMed, you're going to come up with some interesting, and mechanisms of action will be pretty well explained there.
Excellent. Just we're getting a number of questions, so I just want to make sure I'm picking some really good ones here. Everybody is saying thank you so much for the presentation. We've had a lot of thank yous come in. And have you published any of these studies in a book, was one of the questions that we had.
No, I wish I had the time, but here's what's happening. That is going to happen, ironically, because right now I have a tremendous amount of interns from the different colleges that I'm involved with, and they've kind of forced me to put a lot of my case studies into kind of like a manual. So it's on the horizon, right? There's going to be a huge amount of this information coming out, but not just from me, also from some of my colleagues. This is clearly like what we all do, right, Amy? All of us are out there kind of in the battlefield, right? And it's all trial and error. For us, a lot of our stuff is anecdotal, but that's how you build future research, right? You kind of have to start with a theory and a philosophy. And, what I have in front of you in this slide came out of many years of trial and error. And I just, for myself, needed to put down things. Okay, let me do my checklist to see if I've covered all these bases. And if I can cover all these bases, then I know that I've given the foundational build out. So whatever is missing now, I can maybe pick up on testing, further testing, or maybe psychotherapy, because clearly what some of this does not address is sexual abuse, trauma, even though those things would also, pull out nutrients, because of the stress and how active those pathways are overworking themselves. But yeah, just really start at a good baseline. I know it's a lot, but good checklist.
Definitely. That's resonating with a lot of practitioners on the call today. So I don't want to get too, pigeonholed, but do you have any thoughts on the carnivore diet and its regards to the lack of fiber, which is eating all meat, right?
Yeah, I'll give you my personal opinion on that, right? And this might mean nothing to anybody out there because everybody has their own beliefs. I'm not the biggest believer in long-term macro dieting of any kind, right? So like going down high protein, high carb, high fat, they all have their roles individually in clinical outcomes, without a doubt. Look, the carnivore diet has some pretty amazing work right now on cardiovascular health and, some indicators. But then again, you can say the ketogenic diet is really phenomenal with Dr. Seyfried's work in glioblastoma, for instance. And you can go and say, well, the high carbohydrate diet has been indicated for higher antioxidant levels than anything out there. So I believe that each one of those protocols or each one of those diets in isolation for a short period of time might have phenomenal results. But you're not going to be the most diverse person if you're only eating in a macro category, right? And that's concerning to me from the microbiome standpoint. And that might be argued. A lot of people say, well, look, the carnivore diet has been around forever. People used to eat, protein and maybe some fresh fruit or whatever the case may be. But they also ate with their hands and there were more microbes involved and they were out in nature, so that argument to me is a little iffy. Sometimes when it comes to us, I really feel that our diversity and eating seasonally is really probably more important for me. But don't take this home now and say, oh, this guy hates the carnivore diet. Not at all. I'm not saying that. I've used all of them and I use all of them, from a clinical perspective. But I don't put myself down. And I've done that. And that's why I've moved away from it, right? Because you get into this isolation channel of this is the only thing that works. And then you get a patient that it doesn't work for. So what do you do then? Do you not adapt to that? So yeah, I hope that gives you clarity, or maybe I'm upsetting a lot of people when I say that. I just don't want to do macro dieting for a long term. Now, if a person has a specific condition like epileptic seizures or, and they need something in a very macro, or that's a totally different discussion.
Mm.
The general population, for me, I don't know. It's just too narrow.
And the last question I'll ask is, do you use sunlight, all spectrums, for anxiety and depression, or do you have any thoughts on red light therapy?
I've seen some really good data recently on red light therapy. I think the sunlight is clearly the way to go. But I think it's more than just the sunlight. I think it's being outside. I think it's being in the environment, smelling a couple of, dust balls that might, stimulate a little bit of microbiome diversity. And the picture that I didn't add to this presentation, by the way, are pets. Pets are really good, right? I mean, they diversify your microbiome and they produce oxytocin when you touch them. So it's a good antidepressant, as a general rule. That's what I always tell people is like, if you're going to have microbiome diversity, by children pets. It's a great way to get a little bit of challenge in there that is good for the gut, right?
Definitely, for sure. All right. So thank you thank you everyone so much for joining today. What a packed presentation. And thank you so much, Dr. Coetzee, for spending your afternoon with us.
It's been a pleasure.
Everyone look out for their email, like I said, with a link to this recording within a couple days. And then anyone who has any additional questions can send them over to me at Amy Regan, AMY.REGAN @Fullscript.com. And I hope everyone enjoyed the presentation as much as I did. Any closing thoughts, Oscar, to send us away?
No, I just think that, if you use this flow chart, as a baseline, you're definitely going to cover a couple of holes that might not be as obvious, and this is a life's work for me of clinical baseline for anxiety and depression, and it's worked well. So I hope that you can take something from this and help a couple of people out on the other side. But it's been really nice. So when you get those questions, Amy, and if there are any ones that you want me to answer, please email them over and I will definitely get them back to you. Okay,
I'll definitely do that. And thank you so much for sharing. It's really so valuable.
You're welcome. Have a great day. Thank you so much.
Have a great day.